What if a simple act of kindness, a gesture you perform every day without a second thought, could change your life forever? For Maya, a young waitress struggling to make ends meet, it was remembering an old man's favorite order, a black coffee, 2 sugars, and a toasted blueberry muffin. For 3 years, she served him with a smile, unaware that this quiet, unassuming customer was a reclusive billionaire with a secret that would unravel in the most dramatic way imaginable. This isn't just a story about a waitress and a wealthy old man. It's a story about the hidden power of compassion, the unexpected twists of fate, and a legacy that no one saw coming. The bell above the door of the daily grind, a cozy, well-worn diner tucked away on a quieter street in Baltimore, chimed its familiar, cheerful tune. For Maya, that sound was the metronome of her life, each ring signaling another customer, another order, another chance to earn the tips that barely covered her rent. At 24, her life was a blur of early mornings, the lingering scent of coffee and bacon clinging to her uniform, and the constant nagging worry about the stack of bills on her small kitchen table. Her days were a carousel of faces, some regulars, some new, most of them a fleeting blur. But then there was Mr. Harrison. He wasn't a regular in the way others were. He didn't engage in the boisterous morning banter or share snippets of his life with her. He was a creature of quiet habit, arriving every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., settling into the corner booth with the slightly torn vinyl and waiting. The first time he'd come in, 3 years ago, Maya had approached him with her standard, "Morning, what can I get for you?" He'd looked up from the worn copy of Moby Dick he always carried, his pale blue eyes clouded with age, holding a surprising intensity. "Black coffee, 2 sugars, and a toasted blueberry muffin, please, not too dark on the toast." And so it began. Every single day. For 3 years, the order never wavered. Black coffee, 2 sugars, toasted blueberry muffin. Maya, with her knack for remembering the little details that made people feel seen, had it ready for him the moment he walked in. She'd place it gently on his table next to his book, and he'd give a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared ritual. He was an enigma. His clothes were simple, almost threadbare in places, a collection of faded flannel shirts and well-worn corduroy trousers. His shoes were scuffed, the soles thinning. He looked like a man who had seen better days, a retired professor perhaps, or a widower living on a meager pension. He never spoke much beyond a soft thank you when she refilled his coffee. Sometimes Maya would watch him from behind the counter as she polished glasses. He'd meticulously tear his muffin into small pieces, arranging them on his napkin before eating them one by one. He'd read his book for exactly an hour, then leave a $5 bill on the table, a generous tip for a $3 order. Her colleagues at the diner had their own theories. "He's probably just lonely," said Sarah, a fellow waitress who was perpetually scrolling through dating apps on her phone. "Or maybe he's just a bit, you know," whispered Tony, the cook, tapping his temple with a greasy finger. But Maya never saw him that way. She saw a quiet dignity in his solitude, a gentle soul who found comfort in the predictability of his morning routine. She felt a strange, unspoken connection to him, a sense of responsibility. She made sure his coffee was always fresh and hot, that his muffin was toasted to that perfect shade of golden brown. She'd shoo away anyone who tried to take his booth, even when the diner was packed. "That's Mr. Harrison's table," she'd say, with a firm but gentle smile. One particularly cold morning, the wind whipping through the streets of Baltimore, Mr. Harrison came in, his hands trembling more than usual. Maya noticed he wasn't wearing gloves. Without a second thought, she ducked into the back room and returned with a pair of her own pink knitted gloves. "Here, Mr. Harrison," she said, softly, placing them on the table next to his coffee. "It's freezing out there. You should have these." He looked at the gloves, then up at her, his eyes wider than she'd ever seen them. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in their depths. Surprise, gratitude, maybe even a hint of sadness. He simply nodded, and when he left that day, the gloves were gone. The next morning, the pink gloves sat on the table next to his empty cup, neatly folded. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. The seasons changed. The vibrant greens of summer faded into the rustic hues of autumn, which in turn gave way to the stark grey blanket of winter. Through it all, Mr. Harrison and his unwavering routine remained a constant in Maya's life. One sweltering afternoon in late July, the diner's ancient air conditioner sputtered and died. The air was thick and heavy, and tempers were short. A customer at the counter was loudly complaining about his overcooked eggs, and Maya was doing her best to placate him. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the corner booth. Maya's head snapped up. Mr. Harrison had slumped forward. His coffee cup shattered on the floor, its dark contents seeping into the worn linoleum. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow. Panic erupted in the diner. People gasped, and Sarah screamed, but Maya, her heart pounding against her ribs, moved with a preternatural calm. She rushed to his side, her waitress instincts kicking in. "Somebody call 911, she yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. She gently tilted Mr. Harrison's head back, checking his airway. His pulse was weak and thready. "Mr. Harrison, can you hear me?" She pleaded, her voice trembling slightly. "Stay with me. Help is on the way." She stayed by his side, whispering words of reassurance, her hand on his shoulder, until the paramedics arrived. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, his eyes fluttered open and met hers. There was that same flicker again, but this time it was clearer, more profound. It was a look of deep, unspoken gratitude. The next few days were a blur of worry for Maya. She couldn't shake the image of Mr. Harrison, pale and still, being wheeled out of the diner. She called the local hospitals, but without his full name, they couldn't give her any information. His corner booth sat empty, a silent, poignant reminder of his absence. A week later, just as she was starting to lose hope, the bell above the door chimed, and in walked Mr. Harrison. He looked frail, a little paler than usual, but he was on his feet. A wave of relief washed over Maya, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She rushed to him, her face beaming. "Mr. Harrison." "You're okay. I was so worried." He gave her a small, weak smile. "Thanks to you, my dear," he said, his voice raspy. "The doctors said you saved my life." It was the most he had ever said to her in 3 years. The words, simple as they were, filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. He settled into his booth, and she brought him his usual order. As he ate his muffin, she noticed something new on his wrist. A watch. It was a simple, elegant timepiece with a worn leather strap. But there was something about the way the light caught the silver casing that made it look expensive. She caught a glimpse of a name on the watch face, Patek Philippe. She didn't know much about watches, but the name sounded important. She dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. He probably got it at a pawn shop, she reasoned. Life at the daily grind returned to its familiar rhythm. Mr. Harrison continued his daily visits, and Maya continued to serve him his black coffee and toasted blueberry muffin. The incident had forged a new, deeper bond between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. But the seeds of change had been sown, and a storm was brewing, one that would soon turn Maya's world upside down. And it all started with a letter. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day like any other, tucked between a flyer for a local pizza place and a final notice from her electricity provider. The envelope was thick and creamy, made of a quality of paper Maya had never held before. Her name and address were written in an elegant looping script, the kind you only see in old movies. With a furrowed brow, she tore it open. The letterhead was embossed with a name, Blackwood and Associates Attorneys at Law. Her heart did a nervous little flutter. Lawyers. Why would a lawyer be writing to her? The letter was brief and to the point. It requested her presence at their offices on a matter of utmost importance. The address was in the heart of downtown Baltimore, in a part of the city she rarely ventured into, a world of gleaming skyscrapers and high-end boutiques. A sense of unease settled over her. She reread the letter a dozen times, her mind racing through a list of possible reasons. Was she being sued? Had she witnessed an accident she'd forgotten about? The final notice from the electric company on her counter seemed to mock her. Maybe they were suing her for the overdue bill. The next morning, Mr. Harrison didn't show up at his usual time. 7:15 a.m. came and went, and his corner booth remained empty. A knot of anxiety tightened in Maya's stomach. He'd never been late before, not once in 3 years. She tried to brush it off. Maybe he had a doctor's appointment. Maybe he was just feeling under the weather. But as the morning wore on, her worry grew. The empty booth felt like a gaping hole in the fabric of her day. The following day, he was absent again. And the day after that. The silence from his corner of the diner was deafening. Maya's calls to the local hospitals yielded the same frustrating result. No information without a full name. All she had was Mr. Harrison, a name as common as the pigeons in the city park. Her financial woes, which had been a constant low-level hum in the background of her life, now roared to the forefront. The overdue electricity bill was just the tip of the iceberg. Her rent was due at the end of the week, and her tips had been unusually low. The thought of eviction, a fear she'd managed to keep at bay, now loomed large and terrifying. One afternoon, her landlord, a portly man with a perpetually sour expression, showed up at the diner. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Maya," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby customers to hear, "the rent is late, again. I'm not running a charity here." Her face burned with humiliation. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Henderson. I'll have it for you by the end of the week, I promise." "You said that last month," he sneered. "This is your final warning. If I don't have the money by Friday, you're out." He stormed out, leaving a trail of mortified silence in his wake. Maya fought back tears, her hands trembling as she cleared the tables. Sarah tried to offer some words of comfort, but they sounded hollow in the face of Maya's mounting despair. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table, the lawyer's letter, and the pile of bills spread out before her, like a tarot reading of her bleak future. The city lights, which usually offered a sense of comfort and possibility, now seemed to mock her with their glittering indifference. She was a good person. She worked hard. She was kind to people. Why was life so relentlessly difficult? The thought of Mr. Harrison, her quiet, gentle friend, flickered in her mind. She hoped he was okay wherever he was. His absence had left a void that was more than just an empty booth. With a heavy heart, she made a decision. She would go to the lawyer's office. What did she have to lose? Maybe they had the wrong person. Maybe it was all a mistake. But the sliver of hope, however small, was better than the crushing weight of her current reality. The next day, she put on her best dress, a simple floral print frock she'd bought at a thrift store, and took the bus downtown. The Blackwood & Associates offices were on the top floor of a sleek glass and steel building that seemed to scrape the sky. The lobby was a symphony of marble and polished chrome, a world away from the cracked linoleum and comforting clutter of the daily grind. Her heart pounded in her chest as the elevator whisked her upwards. She felt like an imposter, a sparrow in a flock of peacocks. The receptionist, a woman with immaculate hair and a dismissive air, looked her up and down before finally announcing her arrival. She was ushered into a large, airy office with a panoramic view of the city. A man in a perfectly tailored suit rose from behind a large mahogany desk to greet her. He was tall and distinguished, with silvering hair at his temples and a pair of sharp, intelligent eyes. "Miss Miller, I'm Jonathan Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth and professional. He gestured to the plush leather chair opposite his desk. "Thank you for coming." Maya sat down, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. "I got your letter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand. Am I in some kind of trouble?" Mr. Blackwood leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "On the contrary, Miss Miller, I have some news for you. It concerns a client of mine, a Mr. Alistair Harrison." Maya's head shot up. "Mr. Harrison, you know him. Is he okay? I've been so worried." A shadow passed over Mr. Blackwood's face. "I'm afraid I have some sad news. Mr. Harrison passed away last week." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Passed away," she echoed, her voice cracking. "But I just saw him. He was getting better." "He had a heart condition," Mr. Blackwood explained gently. "A very serious one. The incident at the diner, it was a major cardiac event. You saved his life that day. Miss Miller, you gave him another week." Tears welled in Maya's eyes, blurring the glittering cityscape into a kaleidoscope of light. She hadn't just lost a customer. She'd lost a friend. The quiet old man in the corner booth had become a part of her life, a steady, reassuring presence. And now he was gone. She fumbled in her purse for a tissue, her mind reeling from the news. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "He was such a kind man." "He thought very highly of you too, Miss Miller," Mr. Blackwood said. "Which brings me to the reason I asked you here today." He paused, his gaze steady and direct. "Mr. Harrison was a very wealthy man. In fact, he was a billionaire." Maya stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. A billionaire, Mr. Harrison. The man with the threadbare shirts and the scuffed shoes. It was impossible. It was a joke. "You must be mistaken," she said, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Mr. Harrison he was just a regular guy." "He was a very private man," Mr. Blackwood said. "He turned his back on the world of wealth and privilege a long time ago. But the fortune remained." He slid a thick document across the desk towards her. "This is his last will and testament. He had no living heirs, no family to speak of." Maya looked at the document, her eyes scanning the legal jargon she didn't understand. Then she saw her name. And a number so large, so impossibly astronomically large that she thought she must be dreaming. "He left it all to you, Miss Miller." Mr. Blackwood said, his voice echoing in the sudden ringing silence of the room. The entirety of his estate, his fortune, his properties, his investments, everything. Maya's world, which had been teetering on the brink of collapse, suddenly shattered into a million pieces. The waitress who couldn't afford to pay her electricity bill was now a billionaire. The quiet old man in the corner booth had not only left a void in her life, but he had also filled it with a legacy so immense, so overwhelming, that she couldn't even begin to comprehend it. The initial shock gave way to a maelstrom of emotions: disbelief, confusion, grief, and a bewildering sense of unreality. As she stumbled out of the gleaming skyscraper and back into the familiar gritty streets of Baltimore, she knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same. The storm had arrived, and it had changed everything. The days that followed were a surreal blur. The news of her inheritance spread like wildfire, transforming Maya from an anonymous waitress into a local celebrity overnight. Reporters camped outside her small apartment building, their cameras flashing every time she dared to peek through her blinds. The phone rang incessantly with calls from long-lost relatives. She never knew she had financial advisors promising to double her fortune and charities, pleading for a piece of her newfound wealth. The daily grind was no longer a sanctuary. The moment she stepped through the door, she was bombarded with questions from her colleagues, their usual friendly banter replaced with a mixture of awe and envy. Even the regulars looked at her differently, their eyes holding a new calculating glint. Her life had become a gilded cage. She was a billionaire, yet she had never felt more alone, more trapped. The simple, predictable rhythm of her life had been replaced by a chaotic, overwhelming cacophony. Mr. Blackwood became her guide through this strange new world. He helped her navigate the complex legal and financial paperwork, his calm, professional demeanor a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of her new reality. He arranged for her to move into a secure, high-rise apartment with a doorman and a breathtaking view of the harbor, a far cry from her cramped one-bedroom walk-up. But the luxurious apartment felt cold and sterile, its vast, empty rooms echoing her own sense of dislocation. She missed the comforting familiarity of her old life, the easy camaraderie of the diner, the quiet, unspoken friendship with Mr. Harrison. Grief was a constant companion. She mourned the loss of the kind old man who had changed her life, and she mourned the loss of the simple, unassuming life she had once known. The money, the source of everyone's fascination and desire, felt like a burden, a heavy cloak she didn't know how to wear. One afternoon, as she was sorting through a box of Mr. Harrison's personal effects that Mr. Blackwood had given her, she found his worn copy of Moby Dick. Tucked inside the pages was a faded photograph of a young woman with a bright, infectious smile standing on a sailboat, the wind whipping through her hair. On the back, in Mr. Harrison's familiar, spidery handwriting, were the words, "My dear Eleanor, my one and only love." A wave of sadness washed over Maya. This was the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. This was the source of his quiet sorrow, the reason for his self-imposed exile from the world. She also found a small leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with his thoughts, his observations, his musings on life and loss. And then she found an entry about her. "The girl at the diner," he had written. "Maya. She has a kind heart. She sees people, really sees them. She reminds me of Eleanor, the same light in her eyes." Tears streamed down Maya's face as she read the words. He hadn't just seen her as a waitress. He had seen her as a kindred spirit. The inheritance was not just a random act of charity. It was a legacy, a passing of the torch from one lonely soul to another. This realization ignited a spark of purpose within her. She would not let the money control her. She would use it to honor Mr. Harrison's memory, to spread the same kindness and compassion he had shown her. Her first act was to buy the building her old landlord, Mr. Henderson, owned. She didn't evict him, but she did have a very satisfying meeting with him, where she informed him that she was his new landlord, and that the rent for his other tenants would be immediately lowered to a more affordable rate. She then set up a foundation in Mr. Bourg, Harrison's name dedicated to helping the elderly and the lonely, the very people society so often overlooks. She started with a generous donation to a local senior center, ensuring they had the resources to provide hot meals, social activities, and a sense of community for their members. But just as she was starting to find her footing, to find a sense of purpose in her new life, a new storm gathered on the horizon. A man named Marcus Thorne, a distant nephew of Mr. Harrison's, emerged from the woodwork, his eyes gleaming with greed. He had been estranged from his uncle for decades, but now with the scent of money in the air, he was back and he was contesting the will. Mr. Blackwood broke the news to her in his calm, measured tones, but Maya could see the concern in his eyes. He's claiming that Mr. Harrison was not of sound mind when he wrote the will, he explained. He's painting a picture of a senile old man who was easily manipulated. The accusation was a slap in the face. It was a desecration of Mr. Harrison's memory. The quiet, dignified man she had known was being twisted into a caricature of a feeble-minded fool. "That's a lie," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Mr. Harrison was one of the sharpest, most observant people I've ever met." "I know that, and you know that," Mr. Blackwood said. "But now we have to prove it in a court of law." The legal battle that followed was a grueling, emotionally draining ordeal. Marcus Thorne's lawyers were ruthless, digging into Maya's past, trying to portray her as a conniving gold digger who had preyed on a lonely old man. They twisted her simple acts of kindness, the pink gloves, the concern for his health, into a calculated scheme to win his favor. The media had a field day with the story. The headlines screamed, "Waitress versus nephew in billion-dollar battle." She was no longer the Cinderella story. She was a villain, a manipulative enchantress who had cast a spell on a vulnerable old man. The pressure was immense. The gilded cage of her new life now felt like a prison. The reporters were more relentless than ever, their questions more pointed, more accusatory. Her old friends from the diner, who had once looked at her with awe, now looked at her with suspicion. Doubt began to creep into her mind. Was she strong enough to fight this? Was she worthy of Mr. Harrison's legacy? The weight of his fortune, the responsibility of his trust, felt heavier than ever. One evening, feeling lost and overwhelmed, she found herself driving back to her old neighborhood. She parked her car, a sleek new Audi that still felt foreign to her, and walked to the daily grind. She stood across the street, watching the warm, inviting glow of the diner, a place that had once been the center of her universe. She saw Sarah through the window, rushing between tables, her face a mixture of exhaustion and good-natured exasperation. She saw Tony in the kitchen, flipping burgers on the grill. She saw the regulars in their usual booths, their faces a comforting tapestry of familiarity. And in the corner, she saw Mr. Harrison's empty booth. A wave of nostalgia and grief washed over her. He had been her friend, her silent confidant. He had believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. In that moment, her resolve hardened. She would not let Marcus Thorne and his lies tarnish Mr. Harrison's memory. She would not let them take away the legacy he had entrusted to her. She would fight not for the money, but for the principle. She would fight for the quiet old man who had seen the light in her eyes, the man who had changed her life with a simple act of trust. She turned away from the diner, a new fire in her eyes. The storm was raging, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready to face it head-on. She was Maya Miller, and she was the keeper of Alistair Harrison's legacy. And she would not be broken. The courtroom was a sterile, intimidating space, a stark contrast to the cozy warmth of the daily grind. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the rustling of papers and the low murmur of hushed conversations. Maya sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Across the room, Marcus Thorne sat with his team of high-powered lawyers, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He was the picture of entitled wealth, his expensive suit and perfectly coiffed hair, a stark contrast to Maya's simple, understated dress. He looked at her with a mixture of contempt and amusement, as if she were a fly he was about to swat. The trial began, and Thorne's lawyers launched their attack. They called a string of witnesses. A disgruntled former employee of Mr. Harrison's, a distant relative who hadn't seen him in years, a so-called expert in geriatric psychology, all of whom painted a picture of a senile, eccentric old man who was incapable of making rational decisions. They twisted Maya's kindness into a sinister plot. She saw a lonely old man and saw her ticket out of a dead-end job. One of the lawyers thundered, his voice echoing through the courtroom. She manipulated him, preyed on his vulnerability, and convinced him to sign away his fortune. Maya listened to their lies, her stomach churning with a mixture of anger and despair. They were taking the most beautiful, unexpected gift she had ever received and turning it into something ugly and sordid. They were assassinating the character of a man who was no longer there to defend himself. When it was her turn to take the stand, her legs felt like lead. As she walked to the witness box, she could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her. She took a deep breath, her gaze falling on Mr. Blackwood, who gave her a reassuring nod. Thorne's lawyer approached her like a predator circling its prey. His questions were sharp, accusatory, designed to trip her up, to make her look like a fool or a liar. "Miss Miller," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you expect this court to believe that a man you barely knew, a man you served coffee to for a few years, would leave his entire billion-dollar fortune to you, a complete stranger?" Maya looked him straight in the eye, her voice clear and steady. "He wasn't a stranger to me," she said. "He was my friend." "A friend?" the lawyer scoffed. "Did you know his full name? Did you know anything about his family, his past?" "I knew what mattered," she replied. "I knew he was a kind, gentle soul who was lonely. I knew he liked his coffee black with 2 sugars and his muffin toasted just right. I knew he had a sad story, but I didn't need to know the details. I just wanted to make his day a little brighter." She spoke from the heart, her words simple and sincere. She told the court about their daily routine, about the pink gloves, about the day he collapsed in the diner. She spoke of her worry when he disappeared and her grief when she learned of his death. As she spoke, a hush fell over the courtroom. The jury, a group of ordinary men and women, listened intently, their expressions unreadable. She wasn't a conniving gold digger. She was a young woman who had shown kindness to a lonely old man. But the turning point of the trial came from an unexpected source. Mr. Blackwood called a surprise witness to the stand, a Dr. Isabella Rossi. a renowned cardiologist from Johns Hopkins Hospital. Dr. Rossi, a woman with a warm, compassionate face, explained that she had been Mr. Harrison's physician for the past 5 years. She testified that while he had a serious heart condition, he was of perfectly sound mind. "Alistair was one of the sharpest, most lucid patients I've ever had," she said. "He was a brilliant man, a deep thinker. The idea that he was senile or easily manipulated is utterly preposterous." She then produced a letter written by Mr. Harrison just a few days before his death. It was a letter he had written to her, a letter he had never had the chance to send. Mr. Blackwood asked her to read it to the court. Dr. Rossi's voice filled the silent courtroom. "My dearest Isabella," the letter began, "I fear my time is running out, but I am not afraid. I have made peace with my past, and I have found a reason to hope for the future. There is a young woman, a waitress at a small diner I frequent. Her name is Maya. She has a kindness in her heart that reminds me of my dear Eleanor. She sees the world not for what it is, but for what it could be. I have decided to leave my fortune to her. I know she will do great things with it. She will use it to spread the light, to help those who are lost in the darkness. She is the daughter. I never had the legacy I never thought I would leave." Tears streamed down Maya's face as she listened to his words. It was a validation, a final gift from her quiet friend. It was the truth in his own words, a powerful testament to their unlikely bond. The letter was a bombshell. It shattered Marcus Thorne's case, exposing his greed and his lies. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous. They found in favor of Maya, upholding the validity of Mr. Harrison's will. A wave of relief washed over Maya, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She had done it. She had honored his memory. She had protected his legacy. As she left the courtroom, a swarm of reporters surrounded her. Their questions no longer accusatory, but filled with a newfound respect. She gave a brief statement, her voice filled with emotion. "This was never about the money," she said. "It was about honoring the memory of a kind and generous man who saw the good in people. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of his trust." That evening she returned to her luxurious apartment, but for the first time it didn't feel cold and empty. It felt like a home, a place where she could begin to build her new life. She stood by the window looking out at the glittering cityscape. The storm had passed and the sky was clear. She was no longer just a waitress, no longer just a billionaire. She was Maya Miller, the keeper of a legacy, the guardian of a dream, and she was finally ready to embrace her destiny. The gavel fell with a resounding crack, a sound that seemed to shatter the thick, suffocating tension that had held the courtroom captive for weeks. It was over. The verdict in favor of the defendant Maya Miller echoed in the vast chamber. But for a moment, Maya couldn't process it. The words seemed to belong to another language, another life. The crushing weight that had been pressing down on her shoulders for so long didn't vanish in a triumphant burst of elation, but rather seeped away slowly, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. The aftermath was a blur of flashing camera bulbs, shouted questions from reporters, and the firm guiding hand of Mr. Blackwood on her elbow, steering her through the maelstrom. He led her not to a celebratory champagne lunch, but to the quiet sanctuary of his office, the same room where her life had irrevocably fractured from its old course. He poured her a glass of water, his movements calm and deliberate. "You were brilliant, Maya," he said, his professional composure softening into genuine warmth. "You spoke the truth and they heard it." Maya just shook her head, staring into the glass of water as if it held the answers to the universe. I feel Empty, she confessed, her voice a raw whisper. They twisted every good thing, every memory of him, into something ugly. We won, but it feels like they still managed to tarnish it all. The victory felt Pyrrhic. They had proven her innocent of manipulation, but the process itself had felt deeply manipulative, a violation of her private grief and her simple connection with Mr. Harrison. The mud they slung was meant to stick to you, Mr. Blackwood acknowledged, sitting in the leather chair opposite her. But it didn't, because it wasn't your mud. Now the question is, what do you do next? This, he gestured around the opulent office at the city skyline beyond the window, is all yours to command. It can be a burden, a target on your back for the rest of your life, or it can be a tool, a powerful one. He slid a small leather-bound journal across the mahogany desk, Mr. Harrison's journal, which had been held as evidence. I believe Alistair knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't just give you his wealth, he gave you his faith. I think you should start by rereading his words, not as a defendant looking for evidence, but as an heir looking for a map. That night, in the sterile silence of her high-rise apartment, Maya opened the journal. She bypassed the entries about her, the ones that had been read in court, and started from the beginning. She read for hours, losing herself in the elegant, spidery script of a man she had only known in his quiet twilight. She discovered a brilliant mind, a soul wounded by the loss of his beloved Eleanor, a man who had grown disgusted with the avarice and superficiality of the world his fortune had built around him. He wrote of his self-imposed exile, his search for authenticity in the simple corners of the world, his philosophical musings on kindness as the only true currency. Wealth can build walls or it can build bridges. One entry read, I have spent too much of my life behind walls. I hope that someday someone can use what I've left behind to build bridges to the places that have been forgotten. A single tear fell onto the page, smudging the ink. The hollowness inside her began to fill not with the fleeting relief of a legal victory, but with the solid growing weight of purpose. The mudslinging of the trial no longer mattered. Marcus Thorne and his greed were a footnote. The real story was here in these pages. Mr. Blackwood was right. This was a map. And it was time to start building bridges. Her first step was to formalize the Alistair Harrison Foundation, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed a team, but the thought of hiring slick corporate types made her skin crawl. She needed people who understood the mission, who spoke the language of compassion, not just profit margins. With Mr. Blackwood's help, she placed a discreet job advertisement for an executive director, one that emphasized a passion for grassroots community development and a belief in the transformative power of quiet kindness. The interviews were a parade of polished resumes and well-rehearsed speeches. Then Evelyn Reed walked in. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through Maya's newfound status. Her tailored blazer was practical, not ostentatious, and she carried an air of weary competence, the kind that comes from decades fighting in the trenches of the non-profit world. Let me be frank, Miss Miller. Evelyn began, forgoing the usual pleasantries. I've seen stories like yours before. A sudden windfall, a desire to do good. It usually ends in a vanity project, a gala or two, and then the interest fades. The people we're meant to help are left with broken promises. Why are you different? The question was blunt, almost rude, but Maya appreciated its honesty. She didn't launch into a speech. Instead, she pushed Mr. Harrison's journal across the table. Because of him, she said simply. This foundation isn't about me. It's about honoring a man who believed that the smallest courtesies held the greatest power. It's about building bridges, not monuments. She spoke for 10 minutes, not about financial strategies or 5-year plans, but about the importance of a perfectly toasted muffin, of a warm pair of gloves on a cold day, of making people feel seen. Evelyn listened, her expression unreadable. When Maya finished, there was a long silence. "Bridges to forgotten places," Evelyn said softly, echoing the words from the journal Maya had just quoted. She looked at Maya, and for the first time the weariness in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Hope. "All right, Ms. Miller. Let's talk about where we build the first one." Evelyn became her rock, her guide through the labyrinth of permits, proposals, and personnel. Together they began to search for their first project. Maya knew exactly what she wanted: a community center, a place of warmth and welcome, a secular church for the lonely. And she knew exactly what to call it: Eleanor's house. They found the perfect location in a West Baltimore neighborhood that had been hit hard by economic decline. It was a large brick building, a former library that had been boarded up for over a decade. Its windows were smashed, its facade covered in graffiti, a monument to neglect. But their plan was met with immediate resistance. Maya, the billionaire waitress, was now seen as a gentrifying force. A community meeting was called in the stuffy gymnasium of a local school, and the atmosphere was hostile. "What does some downtown billionaire know about our community?" a man shouted from the back. "You're going to come in here, build your fancy building, and price us all out of our own homes." The sentiment was echoed around the room. They saw her not as an ally, but as an invader. Evelyn stood beside her, ready to launch into a prepared presentation with charts and projections. But Maya put a hand on her arm, stopping her. She walked to the front of the room, standing alone before the angry crowd, not behind a podium, but on the same level as them. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but clear, instantly silencing the grumbling. "I don't know your community, not yet. I didn't grow up here. Until a few months ago, I was a waitress, worried about making rent and keeping my lights on. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to feel like the world is happening somewhere else to people with more money and more power." She told them about Mr. Harrison, not about his billions, but about his loneliness, his threadbare coat, his quiet dignity. He was a man the world had forgotten, and he found a home in a simple diner. He felt seen there. That's all I want to build. Not a fancy monument to me, but a place like that diner. A living room for the neighborhood, a place where you can get a hot cup of coffee and feel seen. I want to build it with you, not for you. I need your help to do it right. Her sincerity was a disarming force. The anger in the room didn't vanish, but it softened, replaced by a grudging curiosity. A young man with headphones around his neck and a skeptical expression who had been slouching in the corner spoke up. "Talk is cheap," he said. "You're right," Maya agreed. "So let's stop talking and start working. The first job I'm hiring for is a community liaison. Someone from this neighborhood to be my boss, to tell me what you really need. The job is yours if you want it." The young man, whose name she learned was Leo, was taken aback. He scoffed, but he didn't say no. He showed up at the site the next day and the day after that. His initial skepticism slowly morphed into a proprietary pride as he became the bridge between Maya's vision and the community's reality. The renovation of Elena's house became Maya's life. She was there from dawn until dusk, not as a supervisor, but as a student. She learned about masonry from one worker, about plumbing from another. She organized lunches for the crew, sitting with them on overturned buckets, listening to their stories. She was no longer the billionaire waitress. She was just Maya. Months later, the day of the grand opening arrived. The once derelict building was now a beacon of warmth and light. The brick was clean, the windows gleamed, and a simple, elegant sign read, "Eleanor's House." Inside, the scent of fresh paint mingled with the aroma of coffee and baking bread from the brand-new community kitchen. The main room was filled with comfortable armchairs, bookshelves groaning with donated books, and tables for games and conversation. The whole neighborhood had turned out. Maya saw her old colleagues from the daily grind, including Sarah, who gave her a tearful hug. "I knew you were special," Sarah whispered. Maya stood up to give a speech, her hands trembling slightly as she held a small index card. But she didn't look at it. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at Evelyn beaming with pride, at Leo standing tall and confidently talking to a group of his friends, at the dozens of residents who had gone from being her critics to her partners. Alistair Harrison, the man whose legacy built this house, once wrote that wealth can build walls, or it can build bridges, she began. For a long time, this building was a wall. It was a symbol of neglect, of a community forgotten. Today, because of all of you, it is a bridge. She spoke of Eleanor, the woman she'd never met, but felt she knew a woman whose love had inspired a quiet kindness that had echoed through decades. As she finished, a hush fell over the room. Then an elderly man slowly made his way to the front. It was Samuel, a retired carpenter she'd spent many hours talking with during the renovation. In his weathered hands, he held a small object. "You've brought the heart back to this neighborhood," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you honored the work. You treated us craftsmen with respect. I wanted to give you this." He placed a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird in her palm. Its lines were simple but perfect, its head cocked as if listening. It was the same bird he had been whittling on his porch every day she'd come to the site. Maya's eyes filled with tears. She closed her hand around the bird, its smooth wooden form, a tangible symbol of everything she had worked for. It wasn't a trophy. It was a connection. It was a thank you from the very people she had set out to serve. It was worth more than every dollar in her bank account. Later that evening, long after the crowds had gone home, Maya sat alone in one of the armchairs in the quiet main room of Eleanor's house. The streetlights outside cast a warm glow through the large windows. She held the small wooden bird, its weight a comforting presence in her hand. She looked around at the bookshelves, the empty coffee cups, the lingering sense of community. This was real, more real than the numbers in a portfolio or the headlines in a newspaper. She thought of Mr. Harrison in his corner booth at the daily grind. She could almost feel his presence, a quiet, approving nod from the shadows. She hadn't just built a community center. She had built a home for his spirit, and in doing so, had finally found her own. The journey had been a tempest, but the storm had passed, leaving behind not a gilded cage, but a garden she was now privileged to tend. And it was just beginning to bloom. Maya's journey reminds us that the simplest acts of kindness can have the most profound impact. It's a story that proves that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the connections we make and the lives we touch. Mr. Harrison saw a light in Maya, a compassion that the world desperately needs. He didn't just leave her a fortune. He left her a mission. What did you think of Maya's incredible story and the twists it took? Let us know in the comments below. If you were inspired by her journey and want to see more stories that warm the heart and challenge our perceptions, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching.